All right, here we go. This is the System Failure Podcast, number 72. What's going on, Nate?
Hello, Brian, number 72. I'm very excited for today's podcast because we've got with us the 3D version of Tracy the Wise. Say hello to the System Failure audience, Tracy.
Hello, System Failure audience, Tracy.
So last week we came to you all live from Chicago's O'Hare Airport, and we were saying goodbye to our grandma. We had a lengthy talk about immortality and dimensionality there, and that led Brian to bring up a book he had been reading by Dr. Joe Dispenza, and the title of this book is
Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself.
That's it. That's the ticket. And so we had a little preliminary discussion of dimensionality and its relationship to the notion here that we're living inside of a construct. The idea that we live in some kind of simulation is something that's getting a lot of oxygen these days. So I thought that Tracy has been through quite a bit of Joe Dispenza. I think maybe last year you went on a lengthy Joe Dispenza kick yourself, Trace, and that's why we told our System Failure audience from Chicago that we were going to have Tracy the Wise in studio to help us deracinate. That's a good word. It means deracinate means to take a brush and straighten out wool. That's what you do after you shave the sheep, right? Deracinate the world, the universe, the conceptual ideas of Dr. Joe Dispenza. So with that, I think I'll just give a little brief, hope to be brief, just an introduction to this idea of dimensionality, because you see, dimensionality is the sweet nougatty center of the System Failure constellation of ideas, right? Dimensionality is where finance and religion and like economics and drug use and all of these things all have references to dimensionality. Now, I mentioned a second ago that the 3D version of Tracy the Wise sits before us here today in studio, but I also want to talk about flat Tracy or a 2D Tracy. Imagine a two-dimensional version of yourself who lives in a flatland, who lives in a two-dimensional environment. Now, I'm going to say two-dimensional here to talk about someone who really is experiencing 2.5 dimensions. Right? The 3D versions of us really are experiencing 4 dimensions. Right? We've got length, we've got width, we've got depth, we've got time also, right? And time's kind of a half dimension. With length, width, and depth, you can just look at an object and you'll instantly know, you can instantly take it in. Like you can just look at a 3D object and you can see its entire length, its entire width, its entire depth, boom. But time, when we perceive time, we have to perceive that temporal dimension as a series of infinitely thin slices. So when we say 3D, we mean real life, 3.5 dimensions, length, width, depth, and time. When we talk about 2D, we're talking about a person who lives in a flat 2D environment. So they have length and width, but they've got no depth. They still have time, right? So a 2D Tracy, flat Tracy, still has a birth and a death and a sense of mortality, and still has a sense of sequence of events, but you just don't have the depth, right? So flat Tracy, 3D Tracy, and Brian and Nate, we live in 3-dimensional houses, right? They're cubes or rectangular prisms of some sort. A flat person, flat Tracy, would live not in a cube, but in the 2D version of a cube known as a square or a rectangle, right? Someone who lives in flatland lives in a square, right? The door to their house might be a part of one of the sides of that square. One part might be a door that opens up, so flat Tracy can go in and out of her house, right? And if flat Tracy had, if 3D Tracy had a safe inside of her 3D house, it would look like a smaller cube inside of a larger cube, right? And so for two-dimensional Tracy would live in a square, and a safe where she stores all of her money inside that house would be a smaller square inside the larger square. Is that clear? Does that paint a clear picture?
Overly so, yes.
Overly so. Okay, well,
yes,
good. Okay, so here's the thing about if flat Tracy wanted to experience, say, an apple, right? A 3-dimensional apple. In order for flat Tracy to grok a 3-dimensional apple, she would have to experience that apple one infinitely thin slice at a time. That is to say that Tracy would not be able to experience depth all at once. She would have to experience... Carl Sagan does a flatland demonstration. He's got a big piece of grid paper on his desk. He does this in the original Cosmos series. And the way that he illustrates a flatlander experiencing a 3D object, one infinitely thin, like MRI slice at a time, is he takes a real apple, carves it in half, and takes the wet sopping half an apple, stamps it on a stamp pad, and then stamps that stamp on his piece of graph paper, right? 2D Tracy, who's living in Flatland, would have to experience each infinitely thin slice of apples, starting with like the stem, and then continuing down through an infinite number of cross sections, as if you'd taken an MRI of that apple, right? What I want to really impress upon our valued system failure audience at this point is that you know that there are dimensions for which you are not able to grok or to look at or to observe directly when you're experiencing a series of infinitely thin slices instead of seeing something all at once. Okay, well, what does that mean for, like, I now want to switch the imagery for a second just to appreciate the way that this creates an illusion of individuality, right? So this is going to connect to religion. It's unfortunate we're not on a video podcast because I have to do a gesture here. And what I want all of the system failure listeners out there in podcast land to picture in their mind's eye is me with one sock puppet on one hand and another sock puppet on the other hand, right? One of my hands is talking to the other one through these sock puppets. Just imagine your left hand speaks and your right hand listens and then speaks, right? The point I'm trying to make here is that if you had a sock on each hand and we're using them as a sock puppet, but you could only experience one thin slice of my 3D person at a time, right? The two hands talking to each other would appear, if the slice of reality you were working with was so thin that you could only see the hands and not my body, you might think that these two hands are two separate entities communicating with each other. But in the fullness of 3 dimensions, you can see that both hands are actually connected to me, and that what appears to be two hands talking, if you look at a different infinitely thin slice of reality, you'll see that they're actually connected to the same person, right? This is the great broccoli analogy I'm always banging on about, right? If you take a whole bunch of cross sections of broccoli, like you just imagine going to the store, getting yourself a clump of broccoli, setting it on your cutting board, and then, so that it's oriented left to right, and then whacking it into a whole bunch of cross sections, right? At the top of the broccoli, where the florets are, where the flowers are, you would have a whole bunch of little tiny stems, right? But at the beginning of at the bottom of the broccoli, where it's just one stem, that cross section would just appear to have one, circular cross section of stem. And the point here is that the slice at one end of the broccoli, where there's just one stem, and the slice at the other, where there's a bunch of little small circles that make many stems, expose the apparent epistemological status of those little stems as individuals to be a total illusion, right? And so it is the same with us, right? Our existences as individuals, or our existences of its instance of a much longer pattern, our appearance as individuals has given rise to the fact that we can only perceive one thin slice of time at a time, right? If you could fully grok the temporal dimension, the time dimension, then all of history would be like length or width or depth, ascertainable just by looking at it. So, and then of course there's finance, right? If you think about value, like how much we value things, like human value, right, over time is finance, right? That's what all of your the equations that the quants on Wall Street use, right? They're looking at value and projecting it into the future and taking their best guess, right? Imagine what it would be like to be a stock trader on Wall Street if you could see all of time as a single dimension in here and now, rather than having to experience a series of infinitely thin slices, moments, seconds, minutes, in sequence, right? So you can see where finance is concerned with value over time. Calculus is this too, right? Calculus is all about angles and measuring different rates and then making compound rates out of those rates. And calculus is how you know that we live our lives not at the bottom of a well of dimensionality, but close to the bottom. We're only 3.5 levels up out in this well, and there's maybe 11, maybe 22, maybe more total dimensions that we can't see. So the long and short of what I'm trying to drive at here is that the reality, the 3D world we're all living in is a construct, right? We make it with our minds out of this much broader, let's say 22-dimensional reality. We can only see 3.5 of those dimensions, right? Like all of history exists in some sense, right? In the same way that the slices of apple that flat 2D Tracy cannot see as it's passing through her reality and she's observing one infinitely thin slice at a time, right? The rest of the apple still exists in the broader reality of multiple dimensions, right? All of history exists and could just be looked at and grokked in the same way, as I mentioned, that length or width or depth can be. But we are taking this, we're creating this reality, this very simple reality. It's like, your shadow on a sidewalk square, right, is going to be, depending on the light source, it could be the sun. You could be walking down a sidewalk by day, and your shadow on the sidewalk would be a function of the angles of the way that the sun's playing on you, you know? Or if you were walking at night, the street light might be casting your shadow, and as you walk, the street lights might be deforming your shadow and making your shadow appear to do weird things. You know, it would be really hard to model and predict the behavior of that shadow if you didn't have the 3 dimensions to understand what's going on. If you don't have the 3-dimensional angles of sunlight or street lamps or whatever, then you're stuck with it would be really confusing if you only had 2 dimensions and you're only considering shadows, because it would be clear there's this broader 3D world you've got no access to. If you were stuck in the 2D world of shadows on the sidewalk square, you'd be aware that this 3D world is like generating the 2D image that you're living, but it would be really, really complex because there's a major information loss when you go from 3 dimensions down to 2. So the point here, and this is what Plato has always talked about, and this is what magic, what's at the heart of magic. Right? Plato talked about in chapter 7 of the Republic, book 7 of the Republic, Plato gives his allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave is literally about shadows, right? It's literally about your reality being a cave. You're manacled. You're trapped in this. You're trapped inside this cave, and it's the only reality you know. And behind all the trapped prisoners staring at the wall of this cave, there's a big bonfire, and people are moving puppets in front of this bonfire to create a shadow puppet show, invisible to the manacled observers, because it's taking on behind them, but all they can see is the shadows on the wall in front of them that are a result of the bonfire behind them, right? So you're really talking about a 3D puppet show being condensed into a 2D moving image on the cave wall. Like, I think Plato said that time is the moving image of eternity. That's his quote. And, you can really, when you start to appreciate that this reality may in fact just be a total illusion that we create out of a much higher dimensional reality, it really suggests, and here we go with the Dr. Dispenza connection, it really suggests that the mental realm, this is what Plato said, that ideas are the way that we access those higher realities and those higher dimensions, and that the 3D reality we're currently living in is not but a construct, an illusion, right? This is exactly how Plato described it. And Platonism gave rise to this whole series of magical traditions that went right up through into the Renaissance, right? When we talk about the Inquisition, right, this struggle between the Catholic Church on the one hand and the wizards and witches they burned at the stake on the other, the idea here really is that if you have access to a higher dimensional reality, you can like imagine what it would be like to, like, if you had a safe, like, if I could treat a 3D safe the way that any of us could treat a 2D safe, you could just reach in and take the money out of it, right? Because there's another dimension you can access that money from, right? The 2D walls don't hold the 2D money for us 3-dimensional beings. And a 4-dimensional being would just be able to reach into a locked 3-dimensional safe and just take the money right out, right? This is the magic that we're talking about, extra dimensionality, right? This is what's at the core of the magical tradition. And there are so many connections to this, like drug use, where you would take psychedelic drugs, dissolve your sense of ego, the illusion of self, and still be left with a platform to observe, right? Removing the sense of self really gives you an insight into this multi-dimensional matrix that we actually live in. So I'm going to give my vocal cords a little rest at this point. But I really, the thing that I've not read any of Dr. Dispenza's books myself. That's where you all come in. But like this idea that the realm of ideas is the true reality, and the 3D or 3.5 dimensional reality we live in is actually an illusion, right? That is what's at the core of Platonism. And indeed, it's what's been at the core of the major economic revolts we've had, like the fall of Rome or the fall of medieval society and the impending collapse of capitalism. All like that. We talked about the Inquisition a moment ago. Like the moment when big calcified institutions start to lose the plot is when the weirdos in society start saying, wait a second, the institutions always want us to believe that this reality is the primary reality, and the realm of ideas is just ethereal and not really there, because they want us to wake up and go to work and make the money every day. But when major economic systems collapse, people start to question that paradigm. That's why Platonism was such a big deal during the Renaissance, and indeed such a big deal during the fall of Rome, and why I think Platonism, or whatever this is, dimensionality, is due for a massive comeback. So, Dr. Dispenza is in 2025 making the rounds, talking about the primacy of the mental realm, the place where you decide to make a fist. And he further goes on to label the reality where your hand actually closes into a fist as a mere illusion. Now, is that a reasonable introduction to Dr. Dispenza's ideas? Brian, I'll direct this question at you.
Well, I guess when I think of Joe Dispenza. There's like two fundamental precepts to his ideas, and I think they would be a quantum reality, like one, so there's like a quantum state to things. Things live in many possibilities, which I guess speaks to the dimensionality. And then the other thing is of some kind of greater intelligence, which is an ethereal idea, to be sure.
Okay, Brian, can you just drill down? The first part makes a lot of sense to me, what you say there, but the second part about a greater intelligence, how do you mean that exactly?
Well, I think the greater intelligence fits in well with your metaphor of the sock puppet, because, we have these individual egos. So, yeah, you and I would be separate sock puppets of some kind of greater cohesive. And so things being in a quantum state, I guess the goal is to use the greater intelligence to get yourself to the thing that you're trying to achieve. And so I guess it's just that your emotional state is going to like attract your reality is going to respond to your emotional state. And there's like this fundamental attraction, I guess, to things.
That speaks to the fundamental difference between like magic and religion, as I define it, right? Religion suggests that we are merely tiny observers wandering around inside a huge universe, right? But the magical tradition, the Platonistic tradition, suggests, well, that is an illusion akin to the illusion that the sun orbits the Earth, rather than the Earth orbiting the sun.
Yeah. So, well, I guess what he would say to do, as far as my understanding goes, in light of these things, is so like meditation is like super important, because you need to notice that you're having, if you're having negative thoughts and how often you're having them. And then you need to notice that noticing that you're having negative thoughts helps resolve those thoughts. And then you need to practice having positive thoughts, which is less related to meditation.
I feel like it could be like you get in a habit of just having these negative thoughts, and being mindful and being in the present and realizing what's going on feels like it definitely. I feel like it definitely could still be like a meditation would still definitely be useful on that front.
Well, he suggests. One thing that boomers are always saying is to practice being grateful.
Yeah. Yes.
They're like, well, I'm maybe like you're 6 figures in student loan debt, and it's like hard to again. Your parents like squandered the opportunity of the wealth of the '90s and whatnot, and so it can be hard to do that, right?
They're not wrong though. Like the feeling, the hopeless, horrible feeling that comes from being a debt peon, like I am still, is like the opposite of you're afflicted with this opposite of gratitude. And it just poisons your whole freaking life, man. So it's not that the boomers are wrong. Like gratitude really is the antidote to how I was feeling. But I would base my gratitude or ingratitude on what's going on in this illusory matrix, right? And really, I have to not base my emotional state on what's going on in the matrix. But carry on.
What he says is to be grateful for the future that is going to come to you, and try to feel that. And so like boomers growing up in an all-time era of affluence. This is just like this is much. This makes sense. So you notice that you're having negative thoughts, and then think of your positive future, and then and I guess the other big thing is like you don't worry about like the how, because you just don't know how things are going to unfold. It's just too complicated. The way there's too many interactions.
All right, trying to pick stocks is brutal. I mean, it's so complex.
Yeah. So, those are the things.
Interesting. Yeah, that does seem like we seem like our bomber is over the target here, and because that really just seems like a piece that's everyone's missing in the modern world, eh?
Yeah. So I'd say it does tie in with your lengthy exposition. It's like meditation, gratitude for the future that's coming to you, letting go of the how. Yeah, I think those were the things that I said. Yeah.
I see all those as related to that distinction I was trying to make earlier between the classical view, the bosses, the people that make money off of us, the authority always wants us to believe in the primacy of the 3.5 dimensional matrix we're living in. But the magical tradition has always said, no, it's not that you were wandering around inside God's creation. Right? Science still believes that to this day. Science still assures us all we're insignificant little things wandering around inside this magnificent creation. But the magical tradition says, no. You and I and everyone we know are co-partners with the gods in creating this reality. You have a hand in creation, is what the venerated, the Corpus Hermeticum, which came from 3rd century Alexandria, which had a lot of Neoplatonists there, synthesizing the Christian, really Jewish theology with Greek philosophy, and that we call Christianity to this day. So, Trace, I wanted to bring you into the conversation at this point because I just feel like Joe Dispenza is striking at the heart of this age-old controversy between authority and magic. And I wonder if you would agree with that assessment.
Oh, yeah. Basically, his key idea is our thoughts create our reality, which I think is what we're all talking about, what we're all dancing around.
That's it.
And if I could just talk about the mechanics of it, we have energy and matter. And we all accept that everything in the universe is matter. And that is fundamentally made of condensed energy vibrating at a slower frequency to give it the appearance of mass. That's how we can all look around and see you standing there, and I don't see just a field of air and maybe protons moving around higgledy-piggledy.
And furthermore, this is why physicists have to swap between a mathematical model which includes photons, units of light, as particles, and another one which considers them to be waves. Right? They have to swap back and forth because they have this dual properties to which you have just alluded.
Yes. So we have that, and then go and move to what everyone always talks about, the double slit experience. Experiment. So the energy exists in a state of potential. I think, Brian, you had mentioned, someone of you were talking about potential, until it's influenced by an observer, us. So our thoughts, our feelings, our intentions, it's all connected with that energy around us and can shape what happens in the real world. I should say our thoughts, our feelings, our intentions.
Is this exactly how Dispenza talks? Is this how he talks about it? Is this a Tracy the Wise's spin on Dr. Dispenza's curriculum here?
This is it's what he says, but it's been distilled through my language.
Okay.
So,
right.
Imagine you're walking into a bar and it's full of potential. There's people, there's music. If you feel confident and open, and your positive energy draws people in, you spark conversations and connections. But it's really your mindset that shapes the energy in the room into real, tangible outcomes. Obviously, we know what we do when we're going to a bar. We know we're looking for connection, friendship, laughter, experiences. So anyway, the experience you have is influenced by your energy and the collective energy that's already in the room. And you decide what that is. You are the only person responsible for your energy. Yeah,
that's a pretty good explanation. I usually, when it comes to quantum mechanics, I usually dust off this idea of an email that has all kinds of potential recipients, but then once you push send, but I brought this very analogy up last week in the airport. And so I think we can move on without double clicking on either the quantum, the double slit experiments and quantum mechanics, or on the email analogy. I mean, it was just in last week's pod, so I think that's all pretty good.
Yeah, so that's what we're working with. And then I think the question is, or I don't know if we've arrived at the question, but the question is, how do I change my reality?
This is where I really want to hear what Dr. Dispenza has to say. It's all well and good to postulate and hypothesize about how magic could work, but how does one actually pull it off, right? This is what I hope or suspect or want you all to tell me. Isn't this where Dr. Dispenza comes in?
Yeah, it's well, Brian, if you have anything you wanted to go first.
I mean, it's what I was saying before about the meditation, the importance of meditation, and practicing gratitude for your future. And that's as far as I've gotten in the book.
It's basically that simple. You don't buy anything. It really is just the awareness. Basically, you change your thoughts and you change your reality. And by changing the habitual thought patterns and emotions, we can actually physically heal and mentally rewire our brains and create new life, but you have to notice what you're thinking to change it. And it's just awareness.
Yeah, and what he does harp on is that to change your reality, you actually need to like change yourself, and you change yourself by noticing what you're thinking and sort of changing what you're thinking about. And in doing that, like you change the wiring in your brain and become something else and have like a different interface with a reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wouldn't just be that you have a different interface with reality, right? The contention on the table for discussion here is that you actually would change reality, right? Not just your perception of it, but but the idea here is that our perception of reality is reality, right? It's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and what he also says is, that like there is no difference between like mind and matter. Like ultimately, I mean, they seem like two different things, the outside world and the inside world, but ultimately they are the same. And the actual experience you're having is what's real. And so when you change that, you change reality for sure.
Open question to the Joe Dispenza panel here. Does the good doctor use the word magic in his works? Have you all come across it at all?
I have not, but I'm only 50 pages
I don't think that
in.
he would restrict himself by, I mean, he talks about being, what's the word that he specifically uses? Supernatural. That's one of his book titles, Becoming Supernatural. So I certainly don't think that he would bat eyes at the word magic.
Dr. Richard Spence from the University of Idaho. Brian, on a recent voyage down to New York to hear David Gilmour work his guitar at Madison Square Garden, we listened to this man appear on the Lex Friedman podcast. This guy, he does his bailiwick. He's a historian. His bailiwick is the history of secret societies, like the Russian Okhrana, which was their secret service during the imperial period. That man is perfectly willing to use words like magic to describe beliefs, attitudes, and their massive effect and impact on history. So I just wondered if Dispenza is willing to embrace that level of woo, but he uses a different word like supernatural. You're saying, Trace?
Among many, many, many words.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. Yeah. How long has Dr. Joe Dispenza been at? I mean, I feel like I used to hear his name back in like the 90s, right? Joe Dispenza is a pretty old dude. I would have to guess he's in his like 70s or something like that at this point.
No.
I think the book came out in 2012.
What? That recently? Okay. All right. Huh. That is interesting.
He's 62. He's older than maybe about the same age I expected.
He's younger than I would have thought. But this really feels like the message of our time, right? Here we are with yet another massive economic model that's ailing, much like the feudal system was ailing during the 14th century, and much like the Roman economy was in a state of collapse in the 3rd century, right? These are the moments when giant leaps forward in, I don't want to say progress, but that's when people start to notice, when these economic systems are humming along and everyone's bread and milk is going out and no one really questions either the apparatus of authority they have to live with, and not just the economic apparatus, but also the ideological apparatus that authority propagates, right? So when economic system stops working, that's when people take a long, hard look at their emperor to see if they can detect any nudity, and they almost always find it, right? Because there's in economics, there's always a scam, right? There's always the ruling elites during the medieval period were lords, right? And peasants would work on if you were a peasant, you would work for half the week on behalf of your feudal lord and half the week on behalf of your own family, right? Well, that's an exploitative economic arrangement. And in order to have an exploitative economic arrangement, you have to con people, right? You have to make them believe improbable things, or at least make them believe in a version of reality where it just makes sense to go to work for you at the authority. And so that is why when we are watching as technology progresses and makes the capital model less and less viable with each passing month, week, day even, I really think that a resurgence of magic as it appeared during the Renaissance, or Platonism as it appeared in the late Roman Empire, is long overdue. And I think Dr. Joe Dispenza is one of the preeminent messages, or one of the messages that's most on target. Like we said, his bomber is over the target.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he really brings like a scientific analysis and breakdown. I mean, in his book, he talks about how your cell receptors and stuff, and like quantum reality, and diagrams of atoms. And it's just all a very scientific approach. And specifically, it's like the art of cultivating like an abundance mentality.
Yeah,
if you don't have an abundance mentality, like how do you acquire it? Well, read Joe Dispenza's book. and that'll do it for you.
Yeah, well, one might think that going out and stacking up huge amounts of wealth is the way to get to that well-being.
Well, actually, if we just really combine what we were talking about before, now, like we were saying, how awareness is the solution, and it's awareness, but then you follow your thoughts, and eventually you'll find the negative program, which is going back to what you were saying, Nate, because it's a two-pronged thing happening. We create our thoughts, but then we also, since birth, we've been having all kinds of programming downloaded into us. So even our thoughts, that's kind of the other kicker. Once you realize that your thoughts are not actually your thoughts, you now have to realize who you really are in like the core, in the woo-woo, in that dimension 17, what you are up there. And then you create, and then now you can actually create an abundance mindset. But it's actually very complicated to do all of this, what we're talking about, changing your mind. It really isn't just that. Just talking about the programming that we've received our entire lives. I'm not familiar with every religion, but Christianity really cornered the market on telling its billions of followers that they were riddled with disgusting sins for 2 millennia. Like that has a psychic impact on the whole world. And then, there's our parents' programming, school, government, friends. Everyone wants to tell us who we are. Kids get a small reprieve with like, what do you want to be when you grow up? But even that's still a heavily loaded question. The implication is you can pick from a couple of well-worn costumes like teacher, doctor, lawyer, president, firefighter, but they're all costumes. It's not who they are. You can choose from one of these, and we all grow up learning that. We can wear certain, Nate, you talk about this all the time with archetypes. You choose your archetype, but we're more than an archetype.
Yeah. You mentioned a moment ago the idea that all of us are miserable sinners destined for hell. That idea, as you say, has a real impact on the psychology of people who believe it uncritically because the idea has been advanced by authority. But I just want to plant a flag in this hill. That idea was advanced because it's a moneymaker, right? How are you going to charge people for sin forgiveness, or how are you going to charge them to discharge some of their sentence in purgatory if you don't make them believe they're a miserable sinner who was guilty merely by virtue of being human, right? We don't want people thinking, well, there's some chance that I could not have to pay the church. We want every single man, woman, and child to believe that they need to, pony up to the church to avoid all that time in purgatory. So there's the things the authorities tell us, they tell us because they're economically useful to the authorities, right? That's the con that's ever present in every human society since the dawn of the agricultural revolution.
That is it. That's the con. We, you, me, all of us, everyone as a human is whole and perfect. There's actually nothing wrong with you or me. We're not too much. We're not too little. It's just believing the untrue things about ourselves, which we're driven out of control of one to control another. Yes, but really, we're all perfect as we are.
Yeah, that's it, right? When the powers that be, when their con stops working, when the economy stops working so well, people take an inventory of of the ideas they're carrying around in their heads. Like it's like looking through a barrel of apples to determine, if there are any bad ones in there, right? People start like really looking closely at their ideological inventory and start picking out the ones that, like, wait a second. Clear. The authority told me that, and I didn't have my ideological immune system like on the ready to identify ideas that are being imparted because they benefit someone else and not me, right? So yeah, what you're saying is you have to take a inventory of the population of ideas in your brain and try to identify the ones that were incepted there by other people, right?
I love what you said. Yeah. What was it? Immune system?
Ideological immune system?
Yeah. It's exactly. It's like people tell you that you're broken, and so you accept that belief.
Yes. Yeah. And they tell you that so they can make a buck off of you.
Yes.
Well, it makes you wonder what kind of, Garden of Eden-esque utopia, humanity must have been living in before we got infected by this like crazy idea it's probably only like a couple thousand years old. So, yep. Yeah,
well, at least formal organized systems that generate these. You could have I could imagine an especially clever hunter-gatherer, putting the con on his tribe mates to get them to I can picture that happening. But when it comes to like systems, institutions like the Roman Catholic Church that systematically generate these kind of I don't know, lies or beliefs and set them in the brains of people because it keeps the, because it aids the perpetuation of that system until it doesn't, right? Until the Black Death comes to town and exposes the Catholic churches. Well, let's just say they got no idea what they're talking about and leave it at that. All right. So, yeah, very interesting stuff. I think, man, I get really excited about these ideas. I hope that my excitement is coming through the mics here. But, yeah, I'm going to have to read some of these Joe Dispenza books. I have a whole bookshelf I got to get through. But this is fascinating stuff.
I think ultimately the work that you're doing, the idea of change your mind to change your reality, is you're just changing your mind. I think in the beginning, that first hurdle, you're changing your mind to realize that you're not broken.
Yeah. When Brian first started talking about changing habits or changing my first thought was, oh, man, it's hard to do because my habits have all this momentum. They're like a runaway freight train. It's hard to be the brakeman and pull the brakes on this runaway locomotive because the way that I've always done things just comes naturally, and I have to because it's a habit, to stop and so really the biggest impediment to changing reality is my own inability to put the brakes on that runaway locomotive. Right? So it really does become a head game, right? It makes if reality really is mental, or if the realm of ideas really is the main reality, and this 3.5 dimensional matrix that clatters on or all around us has not but an illusion,
I think we're...
Go ahead.
I think we're really good at hating ourselves and judging ourselves, and it takes... One, you have to learn to stop that, but then you have to learn what else to do, and that can feel uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, I think this is the way of the future, and everyone should be cracking these Dispenza books. It does seem to me that, like, the institution of science, which has replaced the institution of the Roman Catholic Church, as the people who tell us what is and what ain't so. The science is not just the excuse me, it's not just the placebo effect. It's also it's not just the double slit experiment, but also the placebo effect. It's obvious that what you believe about medicine greatly impacts the efficacy of said medicine. So, like, between that and the double slit experiment, or at least the Copenhagen interpretation of the double slit experiment, which, as I understand it, is the best one the scientific community still has. There's other interpretations, like many worlds, or could be infinite universes or something like that. But the Copenhagen interpretation, where reality is nothing but a possibility until you click send on your email and collapse all those possibilities into a single reality, right? If that's really true and there is no objective reality and we're all creating it, well, then science, which is based on this idea of an objective universe and the aspiration to be an objective observer, right, has a fundamental epistemological problem with it that is only now becoming obvious. Like, it seems to me, well, I'll echo the words of the great ethnobotanist and philosopher T-Mac, the scientists now exist in a state of unrecognized tension, right? Because they've got, like, all this evidence is rolling in that their model that they started with, that they had to blow past this assumption that there is an objective reality and that we could be an objective observer of that reality. They had to make that assumption just to set up their little lemonade stand. And now here we are in 2025, and all these results are rolling in from the double slit experiments on the one hand and the placebo effect on the other, and they haven't acknowledged it at all. They've just carried on as if it's business as usual. And I think we're really getting to the point where we're headed for a major inflection point, like the discovery that the Earth orbits the sun and not vice versa, that has come to typify the transition from medieval to modern society. We're due for another mind-blowing realization like that. And I think you've got Dr. Dispenza on the one hand tunneling towards that reality, and then you've got the calcified, moribund authority that is our banking and science authority establishments that are pushing. They're trying, like, in every era, the old guard is always trying to prevent the change and prevent the realization and prevent the genesis and the evolution to a new economic system. And we're going to be finding that again. I think we have got our institutions of banking and science, trying to contain this revolution as best they can. But you got Joe Dispenza pushing from the other side.
Well, basically we have a couple millennia of, like, brutal suppression as our human history.
Yeah.
But miraculously, I guess the light has somehow shone through.
It feels miraculous, but human history does feel like even just the history of civilization itself feels like climbing out of this well of dimensionality, right? What is the proliferation of democracy all about, if not the eliminating the ego from the decision-making process, right? If you distribute decisions among many individuals, then you cancel out the effects of any one of those individuals on the decision-making process, right? The greater the population you distribute decision-making to, the less any one person's individual ego can sway the decision, right? So democracy is a way of factoring out all of our individual egos, and making collective decisions the best way we can by crowdsourcing them, right? So it does seem like there's an iceberg roll taking place, right, where early post in the agricultural revolution societies are very much top down. There's one god king at the top. His least word is law, and so his whole society is a reflection of that man's ego, right? Not a great way. Everyone else lives lives in poverty. But then slowly over time, you get those slave systems of the early industrial revolution. But eventually, in ancient Greece, they start talking about democracy, and you get a nominal democracy in the Roman Empire, even though it really wasn't much of a democracy at all. Even Athenian democracy was just free men, right? If you were a slave or a woman, it's hard, or not a citizen, hard, vote for you. And then you have the Middle Ages and the signing of the Magna Carta in 1210 by King John, of England, and the revolution that came with the end of the medieval period, and all of those crowned heads of Europe get replaced by parliaments and congresses that, again, they're not like perfect democracies. They're at least they're nominal democracies. At least we celebrate the idea of democracy, even if our implementation leaves a lot to be desired. But I think that what we're looking at here is one of the next great regions that needs to be democratized is the workplace. Right? We've gotten this far with in a society that prides itself, or at least we venerate the idea of democracy in principle. But we accept top-down autocracies at work. I think that so many of the problems we have with these massive international conglomerates behaving in an antisocial way is because they're entirely controlled by a tiny minority of people who care only about the profit of those enterprises. And so I just think that democracy, like the spread of democracy, you can see humanity trying to climb out of this well. We're on level 3.5 of at least a 22 level well, and you can just see us working our way gradually upward over time. So I think that there is great cause for hope, in other words, and I think that it's a really exciting time to be alive and an observer of the human condition. I mean, we really live in a hell of an age with the internet strapping all of our minds together to form one giant brain made of many little nodes, a giant network, a giant neural network, So, yeah, I think that Dr. Dispenza's work is really, really important. That's why I feel like I got to read these books.
Yeah, I feel like we haven't really actually discussed the payout of all of this.
Let's get to it. I didn't know there was a payout waiting for us.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of changing your thoughts to change your mind to what? Like, what's the reward at the end of the rainbow? And really, it's just to experience life without suffering, unless that's something you prefer to do, in which case you could actively choose to do it for whatever purpose, for whatever lesson. Yeah. So basically our biggest reward for changing your mind is being okay in the present moment, whatever the circumstance is. It doesn't mean that you're always happy. I think that's really important, or that you feel positive emotions. It's just that you're able to accept the present moment and let it move through you without identifying it. You are not the circumstance. Again, like, what do you identify as? What are you, the observer. And then the real kicker is no matter what's happening, and this can get more dicey depending on how hard your life has been, but you realize that there is always something to be gained in the present moments, because you realize that everything is always working out for your highest good. And that's, again, now we're entering into dimensionality, and we were talking about the sock puppet hands, but now we're talking about the being that's controlling the sock puppet hands.
And this gets to Brian's second part, the greater intelligence.
Ka-chow.
Yeah. Well, that all, by the way, does sound like the gold standard, but boy, it is so much harder to do what you're saying than to accept reality and arrive in the present. It's so much easier to say it than to do it. I have real trouble with that. I think we all probably do, huh?
Yeah, but you've been all of us have been moving, snail-like towards that. I know I see you doing it. God knows I've been doing it. Brian, my parents talk about it. We're all doing it. We're just kind of being judgmental about ourselves right now.
Well, I think it's good to be judgmental of yourself. Always good to take inventory of what you could do better and what you are doing well, huh?
Agreed. There is no wrong emotion, technically, if everything's being equal. Again, now we're getting into some other stuff.
Certainly true. Well, I think that basically concludes our exciting discussion, at least as it stands now, of Dr. Dispenza's work. And I guess have you got any self-improvement corner for us this week, Brian? Anything to report on that front?
No. I mean,
Not
that's
really.
pretty much it.
All right. Well, I say we just let our discussion, even though we're, only about, 45, 50 minutes in, I think that was a pretty good and very concentrated dose of ideas there. So I'll take this opportunity to invite our intrepid system failure listeners to head over to systemfailure.org, where you can find weekly essays about these topics and a great many other ones. If you enjoy what you're hearing here or what you read on systemfailure.org, you can submit your email there to receive those weekly emails in your email inbox every single Monday, and that way you won't have to worry about missing them. And furthermore, if you wish to get in touch with either Brian or me or Tracy the Wise, you can accomplish all of that over at systemfailure.org. And with that, I'll sign off and wish our audience a fantastic week.
I'll bet our listeners adieu.
Tracy the Wise, out.
All right. So long, everyone.